Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. The website is aroundtheempire.com. This is listener-supported independent media. Please pitch in if you can, patreon.com/aroundtheempire, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Follow on Twitter @aroundtheempire. A couple of weeks ago, I talked with editor and journalist Kevin Gosztola. Kevin studied and analyzed the 17 superseding indictments brought against Julian Assange on May 23rd. He argues that a familiar conspiracy narrative and timeline underpins those Justice Department charges. Quote, in order to defend the First Amendment and investigative journalism itself, it's crucial to understand the timeline of events for Chelsea Manning's disclosures to WikiLeaks and their publication in 2010, unquote. Kevin uses his extensive experience covering that military trial to demonstrate the prosecutor's dilemma and to show how specific arguments based on those details will be more crucial than the broad defense of rights. We recorded this on May 31st, 2019. My original plan was to publish this after Julian Assange's first extradition hearing, which was planned for a few days later in early June. But there were a lot of developments over the past 2 weeks and other things that delayed my production of this podcast. And the first extradition hearing was postponed to mid-June, so just this past Friday. We heard about a serious deterioration in Assange's health and a transfer to the prison hospital unit, and there was uncertainty about whether he'd be able to testify in his own defense, even then. So we have some more answers now, and that extradition hearing was held last Friday, June 14th. So keep in mind that this interview was 2 weeks ago, and to bring everything up to date, I'll add an update right after the interview, at the end of the interview, and add some details. So this is just a heads up that you can find that update at the end of the interview. Today we welcome a friend of the show, Kevin Gosztola, speaking to us from Chicago. Hi, Kevin. Thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So Kevin and I are former colleagues. I'll do this disclaimer. I did some work for them alongside Dan Wright at Shadowproof, and we launched this podcast during that time, and it was hosted at Shadowproof. So Kevin, you're kind of the podfather or whatever it is they call it.
I like that.
Yeah. Also, Kevin and Ron, your colleague, have a great podcast, Unauthorized Disclosures, which is one of my favorites. And they've both been on this podcast, so be sure to check that out because a lot of the content here, people who are interested in the subject matter of this podcast will definitely be interested in their podcast as well. So if you haven't already, you probably already know about it, but if you haven't, look for a link in the show notes and check them out. So Kevin followed Chelsea Manning's military trial, like as closely as anyone did, and knows it in detail because he was there. He went to Fort Meade in 2013, right, Kevin?
Yeah. I was one of the few who were there. I can name the people who deserve the credit. Some of them have moved on, but we have my work. We also have a really great document database put together with records from Alexa O'Brien, with some unofficial transcripts. She's doing some other work now. But yeah, there were very few people back in 2013 who were paying attention to what we can tell now from the Julian Assange indictment was really crucial to what was going to happen in the future.
Yeah, for sure. And, he did, really, you can't give these guys too much credit for it because this was not an easy job. He did an enormous amount of work. The environment was difficult. And I can vouch for this because I was watching his work at the time, not in as incredible detail as they were. But, and by the way, Kevin, I can't believe that was 9 years ago. Can you even believe that?
It's amazing to me that when we talk about Julian Assange's case and potential trial, there's a big if here. If he survives, because we've known that reports recently have become dire as to his health condition. But if he were to survive, and if they actually successfully bring him to the U.S., any kind of trial is happening like a decade later, which is amazing to me that this whole thing and the people involved have had to endure a decade of the U.S. government targeting them.
Yeah. They never stop. I don't think they ever would stop. I don't think I don't think the amount of time that passes matters. It's just a certain vengeance that for certain things and certain people. So, but now Kevin's written a detailed analysis of the Assange indictments. I'm talking about the latest ones, the superseding indictments that were announced May 23rd. And he makes a convincing argument that the prosecutors in the Eastern District of Virginia are relying on one assertion, the same premise that was used for Chelsea Manning's military trial, a premise that was undermined by the statement that Chelsea made at that trial. And that statement was widely covered by the media at the time. Maybe, I don't know how much of it was interest in the subject itself. There was a bit of sensationalism that went along with it, but it was widely covered. I do remember that. So Kevin identifies this as a massive dilemma for the prosecutors. And in doing so, he also sheds light on why Chelsea Manning is now sitting in a detention center again, this time in Alexandria, Virginia. So this is a very valuable piece. So it's really important work you've done here, Kevin. So let's get into it.
I'd be happy to set it up, and then we can go into whatever direction you would like to go. I'll just say what my argument is, and then we can talk about the different points that I make to defend this argument or to justify what I'm saying.
Yeah, perfect.
So I recalled that back when I was covering the trial, that there had been something that came up called the Most Wanted Leaks list. And it was basically WikiLeaks saying to journalists, human rights organizations, activists, saying to anyone who had an interest in what they were doing. And by the way, this was back in 2009. So it was before they were really as prominent as they became after Chelsea Manning's disclosures.
Right.
And so they were putting together this sort of wish list of things that they would like to obtain, which is not terribly unusual for journalists or news organizations to do. People do them now. Muckrock is this Freedom of Information Act organization. They put together lists of documents that they're going to pursue through the Freedom of Information Act. And by the way, WikiLeaks, when they put up their most wanted leaks list, didn't say that they were only going to do it by stealing documents. They included legal avenues as well within these countries. So they were going to work with groups, ideally, and it was aspirational. They didn't really know what they were going to do with this list, but they put together this list saying these were the different kinds of pieces of information, as well as bulk databases that we would like to make public. And they put it all together in a wiki. They had it on their website, and the U.S. government wants to say this was soliciting Chelsea Manning to release classified information, which was against her non-disclosure agreement, against everything she had been taught in the U.S. military, violated her security clearance. And so they go back to the timeline, basically, and they say that Chelsea Manning started to work for WikiLeaks in November of 2009, which would have been mere weeks after she was deployed to Baghdad to work as an all-source intelligence analyst. And again, to be clear for people who know about Chelsea Manning but may not really know the work that she was involved in doing, she was involved in handling human intelligence. She was looking at all kinds of data streams that were coming in, and she was piecing together material that could be used for, I believe, going after high-value targets.
Targeting, yeah.
Yeah. This could have been killer capture. We hadn't really seen the full-on proliferation of drones, and I weren't really ever using them in Iraq because we had an on-the-ground occupation. So it would have been sending out probably kill teams to
Squads, right.
Yeah, to capture people or to just assassinate them on the spot there. So whatever she was doing, They believe that in November she started working for WikiLeaks. So I go through my piece and I pick this apart and show that the dates that they have for her disclosures do not exactly match up with the dates that she said she disclosed many of these things, and why that matters, and what they're doing to take away her agency. Because what they need to do in order to prove conspiracy is take away any sort of idea or notion that she could have been doing what she did because she cared about uh, revealing this information in order to expose war crimes or to show that there was government misconduct being engaged in by diplomats. They need to take away any sort of, I suppose the word would be, altruism on the part of Manning by making it seem like, well, she was recruited by this Australian hacker who had set up this media organization. They take the slogan that WikiLeaks had of claiming to be the intelligence agency of the people, and instead of recognizing that that's just a mantra or a motto that could motivate you to do journalism, they say, oh, well, literally, they must be trying to act as an intelligence agency. They must be hostile. And so they believe that Julian Assange reached out to Manning and converted her into an asset who could steal documents for the website.
Now, do they believe that isn't there an assertion that, from the minute that she deployed in Iraq, she was working for WikiLeaks?
Yeah, that's the gap is only about 2 weeks or so. And they're doing this based on some searches. Of course, what Chelsea Manning says in her statement is that she was paying attention to this website. One of the first stories she saw related to them involved the publication of these pager messages from September 11th. These were the people who were killed in the attacks, but they had these sort of messages that went in between, I presume family members. And so she was reading the story. This was one of the things that they had gotten a hold of and published. And she was starting to familiarize herself with the organization at that point. But as far as she could tell, it was behaving like a journalistic organization. In the period of November and December 2009, she comes across this Army intelligence report that she did, in fact, disclose later on. And it highlighted WikiLeaks as a threat. But she was reading through some of the allegations and she was comparing it to what WikiLeaks did in practice and trying to make a decision on her own as to whether she believed WikiLeaks was a media organization or not. And obviously, because she disclosed the material to WikiLeaks, she came to the conclusion that she didn't believe what intelligence agencies were saying about WikiLeaks.
Right. So that's the basis of this, that there's a most wanted leaks list, and the prosecutors tried to make the claim that Chelsea Manning was seeking out the items that were on that list, and she was going into government and military databases to try to find that specific information and feed it back to WikiLeaks because she was their agent.
Yeah, that's correct. And the only problem with this is there's no proof, as far as I can remember, that Chelsea Manning ever saw this most wanted list.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that if she really was working on behalf of WikiLeaks to help them obtain items on the list, why did we only get 4 out of 78 items? Why did she only choose just 4 things? And by the way, those 4 things are not exactly connected to the list. You're actually giving the government a lot of credit if you go round it up to 4. So, for example, they say she was searching for detainee interrogations in the U.S., and then they match it up to the fact that WikiLeaks was interested in trying to get copies of the 92 tapes that were destroyed, the torture tapes that showed Abu Zubaydah and others being waterboarded and tortured. This is what Gina Haspel was involved in and responsible for doing, and now she's the CIA director. But she never went looking for those tapes. She just was looking for, as far as I can tell, detainee interrogations by U.S. military. And I don't know how she would have been able to access tapes that were destroyed, or she didn't ever do a search just looking for documents related to the destruction of those tapes. And if she had found that, I imagine it would have been disclosed to WikiLeaks. So we can presume that that never happened. So that's just one example of where it doesn't quite match up. Not to mention the fact that PFC Manning had access to almost all of these databases that were listed, and a lot of these items that were on this most wanted leaks list. There are 3 bulk databases that WikiLeaks requested. This is one point I make in my report, and neither of those were disclosed to WikiLeaks by Chelsea Manning. So, these are databases that people who listen to your show may not know about, but there's a CIA open source center database that has a lot of the documents in this database are probably internet websites that were captured, so they could archive what was appearing on certain sites. It's probably got news articles. It probably has a lot of the things that we've read, and basically the CIA is classifying them. And the reason why they become classified is the fact that they found something in there that's useful, and by making it useful, it becomes intelligence, and that's how they classify it. If it sounds ridiculous, it totally is.
Yeah, it does.
But then there's the PACER database, and that has U.S. federal court records. But this is not a free database. You have to pay to use it. So that's one of the reasons why WikiLeaks was interested in trying to release the whole database, is so that they could force transparency. And by the way, there's a movement in the U.S., and it's gaining popularity, I think, in Congress to make it free to the public, as it should be. We should probably not have to pay for reading court records.
Yeah, since we already paid for them once, right?
Yeah. And there was also Intellipedia, which is a classified Wikipedia that was created by U.S. intelligence analysts with mixed results. There's a few stories out there about how it never really caught on and did as well as agencies had hoped. So those are the 3 databases, and they sound like nothing that was ever disclosed, because Chelsea Manning decided to go for releasing something on, it's called the Combined Information Data Network Exchange System. And this was where the Iraq and Afghanistan war logs were located, which people who listen to your show should be pretty familiar about. Then there's the State Department's net-centric diplomacy database, which was shared between the State Department and the Defense Department, shared because after the 9/11 attacks, the government believed that there needed to be more exchange of information between agencies. And this is where you find the U.S. Embassy cables. So those are the 2 biggest main databases. They were not ever asked for by Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, but these are the ones where, and this is crucial to the criminal conspiracy, essentially the government is saying that Julian Assange should be prosecuted for the disclosure of these databases as part of a conspiracy, because within these databases there were reports or documents that were then published. They had the names of alleged human sources who were not redacted or censored. And because those names weren't removed, those people were put at risk of death or serious harm. And yet he really was never communicating with Chelsea Manning about getting these databases. So where's the conspiracy?
Yeah, and in fact, you mentioned that the chat logs, alleged chat logs, because I guess we don't absolutely know if they're real or not. They show Manning brought up the CIA open source database on March 8, 2010. This is from Kevin's article on Medium. And Assange informed her, quote, "That's something we want to mine entirely," unquote. But Manning never engaged in any efforts whatsoever to release this information that Assange allegedly sought to obtain. So it even sort of, that's one of the, it's clear that WikiLeaks was interested in it, and they talked about it, but Manning didn't give it to, so that undermines their argument too, it seems to me.
Yeah, well, what kind of employee are you if
Yeah.
you are asked to get a specific database and within a few days you haven't delivered on providing? I mean, she could have. It would have been simple. All she had to do is go through the same process that she was going through. And by the way, that alleged chat exchange happens in March, which is before she's in any sort of trouble, because what happens is there's an altercation in the secured facility where she works that resulted in her losing her access to working on this top secret computer, or this computer that was part of the network. She ends up having to go to this one workspace where she's working privately, and she's not really on the network anymore, and she doesn't have the same access to these databases, so she no longer can release information in the same way that she was doing. And she was having a breakdown related
Right. There
to,
were disciplinary
yeah.
issues. There was, yeah, things going on
And so at
there.
this moment, my point being that she could have easily released the CIA Open Source Center database and never did. And yes, you're correct that wholly undermines this idea that she was involved in some conspiracy. One other point that I make that I have to give credit to Alexa O'Brien for really being on top of, because she has a couple very good posts that go into more detail. I took it basically because I was only going to be covering this part of the case in a longer and wider post that covered the indictment, but she has detailed where the Guarani airstrike video fits in to this case. And this is something that most people who know anything about Chelsea Manning probably have never heard about. So just to basically set it up, we don't need to go into detail about the incident, but there was a airstrike that happened in Afghanistan, and it was said to have killed dozens of people. And there was video of it, and there was also an investigation that was launched into how many civilian casualties had occurred by the military. And Manning was apparently at some point stumbled upon this information and was interested in it. But what's confusing is that the defense has their own dates for when she did it, and then the government insists that there were these dates in November. So the defense has April 11, 2010 as the disclosure of the video, but the government says that she was pulling this video back in November 2009 because this would help them make their argument about criminal conspiracy with WikiLeaks.
So this is part of a required part of the conspiracy narrative that they've come along with to glue all this stuff together to make their case.
Yeah, and they say that she was searching for CENTCOM, which is where they would have found, she would have had to put that in order to find the files, since it fell under US CENTCOM. And they point to an employee who was working for the government out of Brookhaven National Laboratory. I believe he was working for the Department of Energy, and his name was Jason Katz. And I linked to a more full interview with him. If anyone wants to do additional reading after listening, you can find it at Vice, where there was an interview done with Jason Katz. And you can pretty much see right off the bat that he himself wanted to help WikiLeaks and somehow obtained a copy of the file. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the copy of the file that came from WikiLeaks came from Chelsea Manning. And so someone else disclosed this file to WikiLeaks. And I don't know if the government knows who this person was, but the video that Chelsea Manning was looking at was the one that was disclosed to WikiLeaks was a different video than the one that was on Jason Katz's computer. It did not forensically match and was found on his computer after being raided by the FBI on December 15th, 2009. That was when it was apparently placed or saved. But there's enough murkiness, there's enough that you can do before a military judge who doesn't have a sophisticated grasp of technology. There's a game that can be played where you twist searches and you manipulate the timeline and you make this story up that, well, there's only one way that Jason Katz could have had this video. Chelsea Manning must have needed help cracking the video, which was encrypted, and so she herself passed on the video to Jason Katz in order to open the file, and then it was going to be passed on to WikiLeaks. I believe that was the version of events that the military prosecutors were promoting.
Because they're saying that it was an encrypted video, and WikiLeaks said something about needing access to a supercomputer to crack that the password, the encryption, not just the password, the encryption itself. And Katz, because he worked at Brookhaven National Laboratory, had access to supercomputers, and so they figured that they were all acting in concert. I think that's their theory, right?
Yeah, that all of these circumstances have to align, and that's the conspiracy.
And that's why they need Manning to have searched for this video much earlier than she claims that she did. Yeah. Because Katz was implicated in December of 2009. Chelsea Manning's defense says that she didn't even have anything to do with the video until April of 2010, and they need to push her activity back to prior to Katz's.
Yeah, they have a search for Farah on March 22nd, so possibly already becoming interested in March. No disclosure of a video until April. And David Coombs was Manning's defense attorney. And I'll go ahead and I'll just read what he had to say, because I thought it was a very pointed way of blowing up this conspiracy theory that the military prosecutors were making up. He says, let's go along with the government and its logic. PFC Manning hits the ground in Iraq in mid-November. For whatever reason, and just so you know, this was before she came out. So if you hear gender pronouns that do not match, I'm just reading what he said at the time. His motive: I'm now going to use the 2009 most wanted leaks list as my guiding light. And I'm going to give something to WikiLeaks. I'm going to do it because I'm now a traitor. I'm now an activist. So what is the first thing I'm going to choose? What is the very first thing I'm going to give to WikiLeaks and say, look, WikiLeaks, I'm for you? Well, I'm going to give you an encrypted video I can't see, you can't see. Guess what? We don't have a password for it. By the way, you never asked for it. That's not on your 2009 most wanted leaks list. This is kind of like someone showing up to a wedding and giving you something that's not on the list that you registered for. What do you think PFC Manning is doing at this point? According to the government, she is like, hey, you know what? I can go to the 78 things that you want, but I don't want to give you that stuff.
He should have also said, the wedding gift, you couldn't open the packaging was like so crazy you couldn't even open it.
Right. It's got like a lock on it, but you didn't get a key.
Right. All right. It's not funny, but some.
Anyway. No, but it's absurd because it doesn't make there's no sense. But I think the point is that they believe that because there are enough things that can't be proven that it would work in their favor. I believe that the audacity of prosecutors is that, well, if we can't prove it, then we can at least show there are circumstances, and those circumstances are going to be weighed in our favor. They're not going to give the defense the benefit of the doubt, even though that's actually the way it should be, because everything that we're taught about how a legal system is supposed to work is that if you can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt, you would be acquitted. So it's odd that they would be so confident. And in fact, as I point out when I get into this Garani airstrike video, this is the only Espionage Act offense that she was acquitted of. And it involved not the files, because she released the video and she released documents related to the strike. The documents she released related to the strike, she was convicted of disclosing. But because they charged the wrong date or insisted that it had to be November, then the judge couldn't convict Manning of the Guarani airstrike video. So she was acquitted of that Espionage Act offense. It was the only Espionage Act offense that she was not found guilty of committing. And the other thing is, and I don't really go into a lot of detail in my report because I thought it would be a kind of a tangent since it deals with a more substantive issue, but the aiding the enemy charge that could have potentially carried life in prison if she was convicted, essentially argued that she would have committed treason. That involved setting the date where she first started working for WikiLeaks at November 1st. And so she was acquitted of that charge, and it kind of fits into the criminal conspiracy because they're arguing, again, if you go to this indictment, that Julian Assange was responsible for Osama bin Laden acquiring access to these diplomatic cables and these war logs that one of his lieutenants downloaded for him and printed copies, but printed copies off of the internet like you and me. And so there's no direct exchange of information. And that was a failed theory. That failed against Chelsea Manning, and now they are dredging it up again and deploying it against Julian Assange. But it fits into this criminal conspiracy and the way they're fabricating these dates in order to suggest that they're working with each other.
Let's go into just a little bit about what Chelsea Manning, Bradley Manning at the time, said the motivation was and sort of what led up to that before we get into the Assange indictments, because it's key. You know, it has to do with dissenters inside Iraq and what she saw happening to these people who were criticizing, the prime. Was Maliki the prime minister? I don't even know when he became prime minister.
Yeah, at this time, Nouri al-Maliki would have been the leader of Iraq that we had played a big part in making sure he was running the country.
And he sees, or Manning, it's confusing here because it's pre-transition and post-transition, what pronoun to use. So I'm just going to stick with Chelsea Manning. So, she saw people, some of them just scholarly people who were writing criticism, things like that, being hauled in. And it looked like there was a risk they were going to be sent to Guantanamo. Is that the basic story?
The thought crossed her mind that there were people who were being rounded up that could be sent to prison camps or facilities that the U.S. had in Iraq. And if the U.S. wanted to, she thought, hey, maybe these political opponents of Nouri al-Maliki could be put on an airplane and they subject to rendition and sent to the Guantanamo Bay military prison. And so that sparked her interest in revisiting these detainee assessment briefs that were initially something that she just glossed over. She really didn't. She says in her statement that back in 2009, she did actually open these up and look at them. And I think that's part of what the prosecutors might talk about and use to argue conspiracy. But
using the timeline there.
But she was reading over them and didn't think much of them and moved on. And probably was looking at them in the context of some of her work. And so then on February 27th, 2010, there were these 15 individuals who got detained for printing anti-Iraqi literature, is what she said. And as she was assisting the Baghdad Federal Police in looking through who these people were and trying to translate and document what this literature contained, she realized it was just basically political. It was just saying things about the government. It wasn't a terrorist manifesto. It wasn't suggesting that we're going to go launch this attack and do this against you because X, Y, and Z. It was just outlining grievances with the Maliki government.
Right.
And so she brought it up to a superior officer. That superior officer told her to drop it and go back to work. But it wasn't something that she was willing to drop. And she talked to WikiLeaks. She allegedly had a conversation about these materials with Julian Assange. And WikiLeaks did not publish the materials, however, because there wasn't really any way that they could satisfy her. She wanted them to make a report or disclose contents, I believe, without publishing each of the documents that she provided, because if they were put on the WikiLeaks website, it would be clear that they were coming from Chelsea Manning.
Because she had already brought it up with her superiors.
Yeah,
She says, quote, "I knew that if I continue to assist the Baghdad Federal Police in identifying the political opponents of Prime Minister al-Maliki, those people would be arrested and in the custody of the special unit of the Baghdad Federal Police, very likely tortured and not seen again for a very long time, if ever." So, to me, that seemed like one of her main motivating factors, but
right.
in her statement, yeah.
And this is how she gets to, and the reason why I put this in my report, I mean, in general, it's really important to know that this is part of what's going through Manning's mind, and this is her motive, and she's taking in these experiences as a military intelligence analyst, and everything that she does seems to very much impact her, whether it's this or whether it's being in a secured facility, seeing her colleagues looking at a video that ends up being released later as the collateral murder video, this Apache helicopter attack, but listening to that video's audio and listening to them debate it. And then she gets really pulled into it and exploring what's happening in this video. There's other examples like that from the case that transformed the way she views the U.S. military.
She also, just to interject, you note that she learned that Reuters had requested a copy of that video because for people who don't know, the collateral murder video was, Reuters, among others, Reuters journalists on the ground with these, zoom lens cameras that were mistaken for weapons. And then they just got mowed down from an Apache helicopter. It's a famous video most people probably know about, but she learned that they had requested a copy of it to try to find out what happened to their journalists, and they were denied, right?
Yeah. They were not given a copy voluntarily. And it took Chelsea to reveal to Reuters what happened to two of their employees. And so I point out this whole thing with the Iraqi Federal Police. I go back over this whole part of her experience in Baghdad to point out that that's how she arrives at the Guantanamo files. But FBI Special Agent Megan Brown and the other prosecutors want the narrative to be that she asked Julian, how valuable are these Guantanamo detention memos? And then Assange says time period. Maddox says, well, they're 2007, 2008. And Assange answers, quite valuable to the lawyers of these guys who are trying to get them out, where those memos suggest their innocence, bad procedure, also valuable to merge into the general history. Politically, Gitmo is mostly over, though. Okay, presuming that is Assange, they have this chat conversation, and as I argue, Assange never says anything to Manning like, yeah, we would like those, or yes, WikiLeaks would publish those documents. He only says to her, yeah, there's a significance to those documents. Those would be in the public interest. But I don't see where there's an agreement in this conversation. And additionally, she was already interested in these detention memos before Assange said anything. So beside the point, it's beside the point. Whether there's an agreement for a conspiracy here, that doesn't matter. She's asking him because she's already looked at the memos.
Yeah. I mean, and anybody who does research, particularly internet research, that you get interested in a particular topic and you keep pursuing it, and then that leads you to B, which leads you to C, and maybe it's just a topic that really interests you. At least that certainly happens with me. And the context of Julian Assange saying, well, yeah, it's good for their lawyers and, it's of public interest, but he's saying it's not a hot topic right now. And if you think about the situation, the context of what WikiLeaks was doing at the time, they were probably, in the beginning, they were overwhelmed with material, right? And they weren't a very big team. We don't know exactly how big, but they had to go through all this stuff and assess. And, they were probably prioritizing what was a hottest topic so that they could, uh, do the best for the public interest, but also to sustain themselves. I mean, you can, if you think about it in an objective way, you can see how plausible this whole thing seems.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct that they were, even though they had more funds and resources, they still were a very small team of independent people from mostly Europe, and there were a few people from the US and some people, I think, from Iceland that were working together on these disclosures, these releases, and they had the support of human rights organizations as well, and there was an interest from nonprofits. And this was a time when they were able to form partnerships, and they were able to reach out to outlets like the New York Times and Washington Post, and whatever they may like to claim, they were working together as partners, although the New York Times now insists Julian Assange was a source. But the record shows that they were actually collaborating, and they were able to do this, and they had a lot of material coming in.
Yeah, so we had a lot of the things that we've talked about here, the Chelsea Manning statements and all, these are already public. They've been, they've been published for many years ago, and they're an obstacle. Is that the way you would put it, Kevin? Or they're a dilemma, as you say, for the new Assange espionage indictments? Because all of this is out there. It's plausible, in my view. I think it was plausible to a lot of people. I don't remember people saying that, or a lot of people saying that, Chelsea Manning was just, lying her head off, and the statement was, people, there was a lot of interest in that statement. And actually, whether people believed it or not, it's there, it's on the record. And it's getting in the way, or it will get in the way, of the espionage charges. Or, in your view, is it going to just make some of these 17 charges just completely unusable?
Well, I think that the objective right now of prosecutors is to impeach Manning and her statements, and that's why they want to haul her before the grand jury. And it's why they want to haul her before the grand jury before it gets to trial. Now, they don't say that she was lying, and she wouldn't have been lying. She was making this statement in a military court, and while she wasn't being cross-examined under oath, she still had an obligation to offer truth when she was speaking to the military judge, to be forthright and honest about what she was pleading guilty. This statement, by the way, was offered in the context of pleading guilty to what they call lesser included offenses. And we won't get into that whole legal thing and like what I really mean by that. But basically, she was pleading guilty to some offenses at the end of February 2013 before her trial. And it changed the dimensions of what the case and everything was back then. And the judge took this statement very seriously because it went to how she was taking responsibility for the acts that she was pleading guilty to committing. So that's why it was an important statement. And they would like to get Chelsea Manning on before them, and without easy access to a lawyer, because the grand jury system works in such a way that you can't have a lawyer present with you when answering questions. And they want to be able to trip her up or bait her into making statements that they can then use to undermine parts of her narrative or parts of the story that she told, which is, as I believe it, the truth. And they need to find some way to bend and trip her up so that she says something then that they can latch onto and use to prove that, well, there was a conspiracy. This is what Chelsea Manning said, and it confirms that, in fact, Julian Assange was working to recruit her and recruited her successfully. And then while she was at the base in Baghdad, she was working for WikiLeaks. And that's basically what they need to do. And it's why the pressure has been turned up so dramatically since we last talked. I remember previously talking to you for Around the Empire. Since we last talked, she's back in prison for a second round, and she's been in there for several days. And once the 30th day elapses, she will be charged $500 a day after that for staying in prison and defying the grand jury. And then once 30 more days are up, once she reaches the 60th day in jail, she gets charged $1,000 a day for defying the grand jury and resisting. They have now gone to, since they can't break her spirit by jailing her, and she asserts that I've been through this before, it can't get worse, I know what to expect from being in jail, and I'm going to stand up for my principles. And because she's made those kinds of statements, they've escalated and decided to levy steep financial penalties against her in order to force her to a table to answer questions. And that could run a really huge tab. You may think that she can withstand it and we can raise money and funds and she can continue to engage in resistance. But we're talking about $500,000 is how much it will cost her, at least, by the time this is all over. The grand jury will be impaneled for up to 18 months. So once it reaches 18 months, the tab could be more than $500,000.
Yeah, 1,000 a day, so that's 30,000 a month. Yeah, I mean that's just crazy. Now, I'm just going to inject a little opinion here. So they know at the point in time that they called her for the grand jury and then threw her in jail, they knew that she'd been going through a very difficult time. She had made pretty public that she was going through an extremely difficult time, existentially, right? So, and they mistook this for weakness, for lack of courage. To me, it looks like they believed that they had her at an extremely weak point in her life. She also has mentioned recently that she had gone through the physical transition just a few months before this, which I would imagine is a very vulnerable time for a person. So it looks like they believed that she would be particularly vulnerable, that she might cave in, change her story, or that she could be more easily manipulated with lawfare, or more likely they could just discredit her because she would be, I don't know, unstable. So, I mean, that it's despicable. And now the financial pressure. So along with all of that, now they're threatening financial ruin and debt, massive debt. And, I find that to be despicable. But I've seen so much lately of the tactics of prosecutors who abuse their power that I guess it doesn't really surprise me, but it just gets me in the gut here. And anyway, I just need to say that.
I would say to your listeners, we shouldn't presume that these prosecutors particularly know what they're doing in prosecuting this case for a couple of reasons. One is that the Obama administration did not pursue charges against Julian Assange. They recognized that they did not have a case to bring unless they were going to get in the business of charging reporters at the New York Times, Washington Post, and other outlets. Unless they wanted to set that kind of a precedent, then they would have to back off. And so they didn't do the thing that they should have done. So for the people who hear this and say, don't praise Barack Obama, well, here's your nugget. They should have had a press conference, stepped outside the Eastern District of Virginia courthouse and said, the grand jury is done. We have ended our investigation into WikiLeaks. At no point did we ever get a public pronouncement that this was all over, which made it possible for President Donald Trump to continue it when he came into office.
Yeah, pick it up and run with it.
So, what I was going to add here is, well, go ahead.
No, that's okay. It just really gets to me.
Well, I was going to say that it was also real that these prosecutors tried to charge not just a few, but well over 100 people who were dissenting against Donald Trump during his inauguration. They came and they protested, and these J20 trials were something that these attorneys who were employed by the Justice Department were just cooking up all kinds of different conspiracy theories for prosecuting these individuals, and even resorting to referencing right-wing figures like James O'Keefe, like looking at their own, and I use that as an example because we shouldn't presume that this case that they're putting forward against Julian Assange is legitimate at all and makes any sense. Like, just because they charged him doesn't mean they actually know how to successfully prosecute Julian Assange. They're just starting the process, and they're going to try to figure it out as they go along. And I think that's why it's so important to point out here that there's fabrications in what they're doing, and that it doesn't match up with facts. And I also did it to push the media a little bit, because what we saw was a very good show of condemnation against the Trump administration from news media editors, and we saw press freedom organizations get very angry at Donald Trump for his administration indicting Julian Assange under the Espionage Act, which would be, he'd be the first publisher, by the way, to be convicted under the Espionage Act if this was successful. And I see this as sort of like a natural progression of what Barack Obama started, that we had investigations that were sweeping up sources, that were targeting whistleblowers, that were going after former government employees or people currently working for the government. Then during the investigations, they were intercepting phone lines through subpoenas, and they were collecting records, and they were getting data related to communications with confidential sources, and they were treating some of these journalists like co-conspirators, but they weren't prosecuting these journalists. And now the natural progression is that Donald Trump is going to charge a journalist. They say, oh, why don't we move on from just labeling them co-conspirators? What if we actually bring a case against them for what we think was being part of a conspiracy? And so I wanted to push the media to be more specific in the way that they address this case, because they have good words about how they stand for press freedom and the First Amendment, and they have some pretty good words about why there's no difference between them and Julian Assange, and even if you don't like Julian Assange, you gotta oppose this prosecution. But the truth is that that's not really going to get at what we need to get at in order to stop this case. You have to engage with the specifics. You have to let people know just how bogus this entire prosecution is at its core, and that is the only way you're going to move people, because once you show how it's such a flagrant abuse of power by the US government, then it gets removed from issues of personality, conversation about alleged character flaws that Julian Assange may have, times when he published material that he shouldn't have published, second guessing things that WikiLeaks did. You just need to focus on how the US government is abusing their power.
Right. And this, the Chelsea Manning statement is one of the undermining factors. And I'm really glad that you brought that out. Now, just before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about how you believe that the original charge, for people who don't know, Assange was first charged right after he was removed from the embassy in early April, and then a charge of, hacking, basically computer crimes, was brought against him. It was a fairly minor thing. I think it held a sentence of about 5 years. And you were telling me that these other indictments, these new 17 superseding indictments, you think they all still boil down to the same thing.
Yeah, I don't view much of a distinction beyond the fact that now Julian Assange faces uh, decades upon decades of potential prison time versus the computer crime charge gave him about 5 years. And it was a pretext to start an extradition and bring him to the United States. But the thing that's similar and what makes it identical is that it all, if you go to April's indictment and you look at the new one with the 17 Espionage Act charges, they both have the same conspiracy theory. They both suggest that he and WikiLeaks were soliciting and trying to obtain classified information for publication, and they were not authorized to receive it because they do not have a security clearance, and that they knew Chelsea Manning had a security clearance and was disclosing information which violated the rules that she's supposed to follow as a U.S. military analyst, and that she was engaged in this crime, and then WikiLeaks encouraged it by agreeing to accept the information and then publish it on the WikiLeaks website. And that's in both the April and the May indictment that was disclosed. Well, actually, what we saw disclosed in April was an old indictment from March 2018. So the difference, though, between 2018 and the recent one with the Espionage Act charges is very minimal in the sense of what the narrative is that the government has. It all boils down to Julian Assange recruiting and working Chelsea Manning as this kind of insider that could purloin documents for the WikiLeaks website. And when you look at the computer crime charge that was put in the sealed indictment in 2018, what they're alleging has language from the Espionage Act. And I know from covering Chelsea Manning's case and many different whistleblower cases what that language is in the Espionage Act about knowingly receiving information, willfully communicating it to a person not authorized to receive it. That's sort of verbiage that I hear and alarm bells ring. And I saw that in the computer crime offense. So you're asking yourself, like, how could that be part of an allegation that they violated the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act? It's because they were charging him with a computer crime offense for what they believed to be a violation of the Espionage Act. So they were essentially mischarging Julian Assange, even though, I mean, what they really wanted to do was just start the process rolling of extraditing. And now I've heard people talk about different ideas. I'll just speak to the speculation that's out there. There's a lot of swirling speculation about why did the Justice Department choose to add these 17 Espionage Act charges? Doesn't it make it next to impossible for them to successfully extradite him now? Because in the courts, they're going to recognize that this is a political case, and they're not going to want to release him to the United States, where, not only would he face this political prosecution, but he also is probably going to be held in a supermax prison, and he'll be in conditions of solitary confinement, and he could be cruelly mistreated. And we have so many horror stories from the U.S.'s incarceration system that suggest that we probably shouldn't release him. And we also have this case that is a precedent involving Lori Love, who was a hacker who survived and avoided being extradited to the U.S. a few years ago. And I think I think it's a precedent that works in Julian Assange's favor. So was it deliberate? Did the Justice Department there's this sort of like rumor going around that someone within the Justice Department is maybe trying to sabotage this by making it harder for him to be extradited from the from a European country, and that these 17 Espionage Act charges were some part of a
To
like
protect him. Yeah.
overreach to make sure that like this dangerous precedent is actually never set in the U.S. And I just, like I honestly don't know. I'm not in the minds of these prosecutors. And for one, the only reason why I would say that doesn't seem like a valid theory to me is because when you listen to these prosecutors, I think they really believe in what they're doing. When you listen to John Demers, who is from the National Security Division, and he comes out and he says, some people say that Julian Assange is a journalist. Julian Assange is no journalist, and then proceeds to do what the government should never be allowed to do, which is decide who is and is not a journalist. I say to you that I think they really mean to do this case. I think they really mean to prosecute it, and I think they fervently believe that they can prosecute him without causing a precedent to be set that allows for the prosecution of journalists, because they're going to claim in court that Julian Assange is not a journalist. And, if not a military judge, but if a federal judge says, what about the concerns in this case that what you're prosecuting this person for is in violation of the First Amendment? And if the prosecutors answer, they're going to come up with some answer that says that there's a certain point when he lost First Amendment protections. And that's going to be a huge part of this case, is where and when, and whether the court that this is being heard in the Eastern District of Virginia is where it will be held.
Yeah.
Will they buy that at some point Julian Assange lost his First Amendment protections?
Yeah, I mean, you have to remember what court this is happening in, right?
Yeah.
Nobody wins in this court, right? And also, they seem very confident of being able to coerce the UK government, and I don't see much to argue that the UK government won't be coerced. They've done some years of sort of propaganda prep work to undermine any support for Julian Assange. Plus, everything's secret. It's hard to find out anything. Yeah, I mean, anything's possible, but and also I can see, Pompeo, his speech, when he first became the head of the CIA, calling Assange, a hostile non-state intelligence agency. So, yeah, it does not jive with me that anyone would be trying to undermine the prosecution of Assange. I mean, what we also have to take into consideration is the prosecutors are notorious for throwing huge numbers of, overcharging, because they'll, coerce a plea deal, or they'll get them on one of them. And this is the Eastern District of Virginia. They're going to get them on one of them. So, yeah, I agree with you on that.
And the one last thing I want to get in here before we would wrap is that we've heard from people like Chuck Todd in the media, who have taken what's going on and run with it by saying, okay, I don't like what the Donald Trump administration is doing, because it puts us in a position where we would have to defend Julian Assange, and I don't like it. And essentially the way that he thinks the press can get out of it is by calling the Donald Trump administration's bluff and saying, look, we agree with you. Julian Assange is not a journalist. So therefore, we do not have to buy into what you're doing. We don't have to resist it. We don't have to fight you on this, because, we don't have to give you the fight that you want, basically. Because he's thinking that Donald Trump wants a fight with the media, wants some kind of a case that he can show that he's putting the press in their place. And Chuck says, well, the way we can get around that is just say Julian Assange is not a journalist. He's a hacker. And that basically just plays into the prosecution's hands. That's exactly the wrong, and it's a really stupid way of reacting to what is going on here. But that's what we've heard Chuck Todd say. And there's, I think there's other people in the media who believe that they can hedge as to their interactions with WikiLeaks in order to protect and save their own skin.
Yeah.
And I would say that we're long past that point. If you wanted to save your skin 10 years ago, this is my last thing I'll say. Almost 10 years ago, when the grand jury was launched, the time to save your skin, the time to speak out and prevent something horrible from happening, something that crossed a Rubicon and set in motion a chain of events that you wouldn't be able to turn back from, the time to speak was when we knew that the grand jury was launched to investigate WikiLeaks, when we knew that we were seeing reports of search warrants into Google communications and different accounts that WikiLeaks had, when we saw Joe Lieberman using his influence to pressure Amazon to no longer offer cloud space to WikiLeaks, when you saw pressure on websites and other organizations and corporations like PayPal to no longer process payments to WikiLeaks, that was the time to speak up, because that can be done to any journalist who the government wants to shut down. And now we're at the point where they're going to do what will pay dividends. They're going to carry out the thing that they've been eager to carry out for a long time, but didn't think they had the wiggle room to do because of our Constitution.
Yeah, and they felt, they were in a privileged place. They didn't think they thought they were protected. Now they're not so confident about that. But yeah, you're absolutely right. They seem to have blinders for these slippery slopes, and we're all for the worse. All right, Kevin, thank you so much. This is really well done. I really appreciate it. And I don't think we're getting this angle from anywhere else. So more kudos to you. Please do let everybody know if there's anything else you want to say, please do. But be sure to let people know how to find your work and how to support you.
Yeah, well, the only thing I'd say to what you just said there was almost everything that Julian Assange's attorneys have ever warned about has also been shown to be true. And I think that's important as well. All these alarm bells about we don't want our client to be sent to Sweden without any assurances that the U.S. would pick him up and then send him there, and then all this other complaints about his health while he was in the Ecuadorian embassy and how Ecuador was no longer looking after his safety and well-being. I mean, everything that they've ever raised alarms about has turned out to be true. So It's clear here who we should believe and who we should not believe. You can find my work at shadowproof.com. This is where I and my colleague Brian Sonnenstein work and follow many of these stories, along with stories covering prison issues in the United States and other important issues and topics. And then my podcast can be found on iTunes, or you can find it online by searching, and it's Unauthorized Disclosure. So thank you.
Okay, great, Kevin. Thanks so much. As I mentioned in the intro, we recorded this 2 weeks ago on May 31st, 2019. My original plan was to publish this after the first extradition hearing a few days later in early June, but that hearing was postponed. And there were a lot of developments also over the past 2 weeks. So let me provide some updated information on those just to bring this up to date. I'll do it in a timeline format. So on May 31st, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Niels Melzer, released his statement after his visit with Julian, along with 2 medical experts, in Belmarsh prison in early May. So he visited in early May, but he didn't release his report until some weeks later. Melzer said that he fears that Assange's human rights could be seriously violated if he's extradited to the United States, and condemned the deliberate and concerted abuse inflicted for years on Assange, which he labeled as collective persecution. Melzer's been doing some interviews with numerous news outlets and speaking out on Twitter also. Melzer said that Assange, quote, has been deliberately exposed for a period of several years to progressively severe forms of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, the cumulative effects of which can only be described as psychological torture, unquote. On May 31st, Melzer also said on Twitter, Quote, "For the record, I never said I considered Julian Assange a bad actor, but that initially I'd been affected by the same misguided smear campaign as everybody else, and only saw the real facts once I investigated in detail," unquote. So the first extradition court hearing was postponed until June 14th because of a serious deterioration in Assange's health and a transfer to the prison hospital unit. And on June 3rd, also another related issue in the Swedish court, a ruling in the Swedish district court prevented Swedish prosecutors from applying for an extradition warrant. They dropped their investigation in 2017, but they reopened it after Ecuador revoked Assange's asylum in April. The court judgment said, quote, "As Julian Assange is currently serving a prison sentence, the investigation can proceed with the help of a European investigation order, which does not require that Julian Assange's detention in Sweden. The court therefore does not find it proportional to detain Julian Assange," unquote. So there may end up being a competing extradition request from the United States and from Sweden, but not now. On June 6th, Cassandra Fairbanks released photos of Assange inside Belmarsh prison. She claimed that she made contact with an inmate in the prison, I believe she said it was over Twitter, who took these photos with a contraband phone, and then the photos were posted, and then she wrote an article and published those photos, and said that the photos were from some weeks ago, like before his being put in the prison hospital, obviously, and sometime in the month of May. Also on June 6th, WikiLeaks announced that the U.S. Department of Justice was preparing to file another indictment against Assange, using as a witness a man from Iceland, who referred to this man, I'm probably going to botch this pronunciation, Sigurdur Thordarson, and they referred to him as, quote, "a sociopath, convicted con man, a sex criminal involved in an FBI entrapment operation against WikiLeaks." So this is separate from the 17 superseding indictments or the original indictment. On June 7th, Rupley published a video of Julian Assange inside the Belmarsh prison, and Cassandra Fairbanks said that she can confirm that that video is from the same source as hers, and that the photos she published were actually screenshots from that video. On June 10th, Washington Post reported that the U.S. had delivered a formal extradition request to the UK on June 6th. They also reported that, quote, "Sigurdur Thordarson, a former WikiLeaks associate who became an FBI informant, says he voluntarily met with prosecutors in Virginia late last month and was asked detailed questions about Assange's relationship with hackers," unquote. Then on June 11th, Julian Assange's father, John Shipton, gave an interview outside Belmarsh prison after visiting with Assange. He said that Assange's health had improved somewhat. He had originally scheduled a visit on June 6th, and he told the press that the visit was canceled at the last minute due to doctors being called in to treat Julian on short notice. On June 13th, the UK Home Secretary, Sajid Javid, certified the U.S. extradition request, which was a procedural step that allowed the case to go forward. On BBC Radio, the UK Home Secretary Javid said, quote, "He's rightly behind bars. There's an extradition request from the U.S. that is before the courts tomorrow, but yesterday I signed the extradition order and certified it, and that will be going in front of the courts tomorrow." And then he said, "It's a decision ultimately for the courts, but there is a very important part of it for the Home Secretary, and I want to see justice done at all times, and we've got a legitimate extradition request, so I've signed it, but the final decision is now at the courts," unquote. On June 14th, Assange appeared at the Westminster Magistrates Court via video link, and the judge set a court date for his full 5-day extradition hearing some 8 months from now in February 2020. Also on June 14th, Chelsea Manning got a response from the government to a request that she had previously made by her legal team to reconsider the sanctions that were slapped on her. Among other things, they note that the government charged Julian Assange with the 17 superseding indictments without Manning's testimony, so it wasn't needed, and that the financial sanctions imposed on her are punitive, not coercive. The DOJ responded on Friday, June 14th. On Twitter, WikiLeaks said, quote, "On Friday, the DOJ claimed that it needs to coerce Manning into testifying before a grand jury because her testimony is, quote, essential to an ongoing investigation into charges or targets that are not included in the superseding indictment against Assange," unquote. They also refused to accept her argument about financial hardship and doubt that she's really resisting the grand jury on principle, as she claims. In their filing, the DOJ says, quote, "Manning's self-serving objections to the grand jury system are insufficient to demonstrate that the court's sanctions will not have a coercive effect." And they say, "Manning's recent recalcitrance has raised her profile and returned her to the news cycle, which could increase the demand for her as a speaker after her release. Indeed, Manning has actively sought publicity through the current proceedings, for example by holding a press conference in front of the courthouse before the contempt hearing and publicly posting messages on Twitter." And then they say, "Nor does this recent superseding indictment against Assange render the sanctions punitive. Even after returning an indictment, the grand jury may continue investigating new charges or targets which are related to the pending indictment. Manning's testimony remains relevant and essential to an ongoing investigation into charges or targets and are not included in the superseding indictment," unquote. And that's the end of the update. Hopefully that provides enough information to have a full picture of the situation. Thanks. And thank you for listening. Special thanks to Kevin Gosztola. Follow Kevin on Twitter at @kgosztola. Find his work at shadowproof.com. Subscribe to his podcast, Unauthorized Disclosure. Around the Empire is listener-supported independent media. Pitch in if you can at patreon.com/aroundtheempire, paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please help me build up the YouTube channel by subscribing. That's free to do that. youtube.com/aroundtheempire. The Around the Empire audio podcast has been the main focus, where we have the most traffic. There are a lot of ways to listen to it. Find it, subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Listen to it on the website, aroundtheempire.com, or on patreon.com/aroundtheempire, or on YouTube, youtube.com/aroundtheempire. If you're listening to this on YouTube, hit the thumbs up to like the video. Leave me a comment. Don't forget to subscribe. We'll see you next time. Take care, everyone.